by the late 2000s and early 2010s, the network's Saturday morning landscape was in a huge downward spiral. While their respective offerings ranged from decent to actually pretty good, unfortunately, they were unable to effectively compete. Thanks to tightened restrictions on children's advertising, the networks wanting to fully comply within the EI regulations, and the heavy competition from the big three kids cable networks. However, that didn't mean they weren't putting up a decent fight, and one of the few blocks doing so was Kids WB on the then new CW network, which was carried over from the WB. But its time on the air wouldn't last much longer, as on May 24th, 2008, it was replaced by a new block, the CW4Kids, which was handled by 4Kids Entertainment. Then, 2 years later, the block was rebranded as Toonzai on August 14, 2010, and 2 years after that, it was relaunched as Vortexx on August 18, 2012. But even this change didn't do any good, and it would officially shut down on September 27, 2014, and along with it, the end of traditional Saturday morning blocks. So, what exactly happened during all of that time? It seemed that both blocks had plenty of promise with providing shows the other major networks couldn't bring, only for them to not connect strongly with audiences as well as they should have, and just limped along to its end. Well, all of that and more we'll be uncovering and answering in this video. So, with that lengthy introduction out of the way, I'm the Media Nutso, and it's finally time for us to take a deep dive into the history of the CW4Kids, Toonzai, and Vortexx. Of course, before we can truly get things going, we first need to lay out the foundation of how the CW4Kids came into existence. It first began in late 2007, and more specifically, the final season of Kids WB. Sadly, at this point, Kids WB was now a hollow shell of its former glory. Many of the block's most popular shows had either ended production or had been dropped from the block altogether, and although it was averaging a .98 rating and remained as the top-rated network's Saturday morning block, that position no longer mattered, and many of their newer shows weren't as popular as the ones that came years before. What didn't help either was that the block was dealt a huge blow, thanks to the government clamping down on food ads aimed at kids, which dramatically reduced ad revenue, and its in-house staff was reduced to only 10 employees. Needless to say, it was clear that Kids WB was not gonna last much longer, and the higher-ups at Time Warner and CBS agreed that a huge overhaul was very much needed. So, on October 2nd, 2007, the CW announced they would officially shut down Kids WB at the end of the season, and that they had reached a 4-year agreement with 4Kids Entertainment to create and program a new block, which would eventually become the CW4Kids. During this same time, 4Kids have been having great success with handling Fox's Saturday morning block for 6 years, which first began as the Fox Box in 2002 and was later rebranded 4Kids TV in 2005. By 2008, however, both parties were having various issues, like 4Kids not having paid Fox for the time lease in a good while, and Fox not securing the 90% clearance for the block due to many of their affiliates refusing to carry it and not being able to get any secondary affiliates to pick it up. So, on November 10, 2008, 4Kids announced that 4Kids TV would end its run on Fox, which it did a month later on December 12th. Alright, flipping it back over to the CW, Kids WB would air for the very last time on May 17, 2008. And the next week on the 24th, the CW4Kids made its network debut. So now that we've got all of that laid out, it's high time we take a deep look at how this block played out. When the CW4Kids first began, it initially took over the entire lineup. Now, I know many of you are saying, well, no duh, of course they took it over. That's what was asked of them. Yes, but I also meant it literally. Likely due to contractual obligations, for the first couple of months on the air, the block carried over all of the shows from Kids WB's final lineup, which included Johnny Test, Eon Kid, Magi Nation, Skunk Fu, The Spectacular Spider-Man, Tom and Jerry Tales, Will and Do It, World of Quest, and a little later on, The Batman. They even repurposed nearly all of the bumpers that were created during that season, but changed all mentions of Kids WB with the CW4Kids. It wasn't until June 21st when the block began to make some changes to the schedule. Along with the return of the Batman, there was Chaotic, based on the trading card game of the same name, the 2003 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series where it premiered its final season, Back to the Sewer, and Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, the second series in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, which was only in reruns as the show had premiered on Cartoon Network's Magoozy block over 2.5 years earlier. Funny enough, those three wound up replacing Eon Kid, Johnny Test, and World of Quest, which had ended their runs on the block earlier on the 14th. Also, considering they kept the same structure of the block intact, this meant the 7 to 8 AM time slot was mainly used to fulfill the EI guidelines, which was where Magi Nation and Will and Do It ended up in. And they would not be the only shows to land there, but we'll bring them up as we go along. Overall, it was a pretty decent lineup for the block to start with. During its first few months on the air, the CW4Kids performed modestly well. Sure, it wasn't exactly a blockbuster hit, only scoring a .88 rating, but it was good enough for the CW executives to keep it going. Near the start of the 2008-2009 season, the Batman ended its run on August 2nd, then Tom and Jerry Tales and Yu-Gi-Oh! GX followed suit on September 6th, and the next week on the 13th, the block saw the premiere of a new anime series, Dinosaur King, based on the trading card and Sega arcade games, Viva Pinata, based on the Xbox 360 video games, and the third Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. It also adopted the bumpers that were used during 4Kids TV's final season, which included, but not limited to, mazes, racetracks, and web pages, though not every bumper style was adopted, and even the end credits layout. Then on September 20th, Magi Nation was taken off the block and was replaced by Go-Go Ricky the following week. Next, Skunk Fu left the block on October 18th. After that, Kamen Rider Dragon Knight, the American adaptation of Kamen Rider Ryuki, made its debut on December 13th. Then, on January 3rd, 2009, both Huntic, Secrets and Seekers, and Sonic X made their block debut. Then, 28 days later, on January 31st, the Spectacular Spider-Man was taken off the block schedule. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, during this same time, 4Kids TV was still running on the Fox network. This meant from May 24th up through December 12th, 4Kids was running two different Saturday morning blocks. Though it is worth mentioning that not all of the shows that initially aired on the latter got to air on the former later on. The only shows that weren't carried over from 4Kids TV were Daigata Defenders, the 2006 revival of Biker Mice from Mars, and The Adrenaline Project, despite the latter having been given a second season in its home country. Anyways, on April 4th, Will and Do It would air for the final time on the block and was taken off the next week. Then, during the summer of 2009, the block saw the debut of both Winx Club and Kirby Right Back At Ya. Beginning in the 2009-2010 season, they started rerunning the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series on September 5th, then Kirby Right Back At Ya was taken off the block the next week on the 12th, and the following week on the 17th, it was replaced by the Canadian series Robots. However, That show would only run on the block for 3 months before it was taken off on January 23, 2010. Then, 3 months later, on April 24th, they began rerunning Magical Do-Re-Mi alongside Winx Club, though it was likely because their license with the show was going to expire and decided to give the show one last go before they lost it for good. Following afterwards, on July 24th, both Magical Do-Re-Mi and Winx Club were taken off the schedule for good and were replaced by a full hour of Cubix Robots for Everyone. However, backing up to September 12, 2009, the block saw the debut of Kirby Right to the Finish, which was just a compilation of the last 4 episodes of Kirby Right Back At Ya that didn't air on 4Kids TV. Then, over 2 months later, the CW4Kids premiered the Ninja Turtles movie Turtles Forever on November 21st, which was made to coincide with the franchise's 25th anniversary. Afterwards, it would be rebroadcast 3 more times on the block, first on March 20th, then on May 29th, and one more time on August 28, 2010. But those specials weren't the only things the CW4Kids brought to the table. They also aired various short series of interstitials during this time, which included 2 short series from Go-Go Ricky, Go-Go Toons, and Go-Go Wiki, Pat and Stan, a short French animated series that originally aired as a part of the programming block Tifu, TMNT Mayhem from Mutant Island, a mini-series that first aired on both 4Kids website and on the block in between Back to the Sewer and Chaotic, which was then later re-aired as a single episode, the CW4Kids Vault, which showcased clips from Viva Pinata and Skunk Fu, and finally, there were the Magical Do-Re-Mi Witchling sing-alongs, which were carried over from when the show aired on 4Kids TV. These music videos would be played at the end of every episode. With all that said, even with those specials and shows being rotated in and out, it didn't exactly help boost the block's ratings. Not that it was tanking, though it was steadily declining, just that it wasn't growing the way they'd hoped. Thus, in order to reinvigorate the block, it was decided some big changes were needed. So, on April 27th, 4Kids announced that the block would be rebranded as Toonzai, which would take effect on August 14th, though the CW4Kids name would remain. Of course, as this was a major rebrand, it also meant a set of new bumpers and interstitials, which featured a new mascot character named Shoji. As for the shows, Cubix, Sonic X, TMNT, and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds would remain on the schedule. However, Ninja Turtles' time would be very short-lived, as it only ran 1 week before it was taken off the schedule, most likely as a result of the franchise being purchased by Viacom, now Paramount Skydance Corporation, the year before. Then, the following week on August 28th, the block saw the premiere of Dragon Ball Z Kai, a truncated reversion of the original Dragon Ball Z. It had first debuted on the Nicktoons channel 4 months earlier on April 24th, but then 4Kids acquired the broadcast rights to air it on the CW. But there would be a few catches with this version. See, when the show aired on Nicktoons, it was edited in order to make it more kid-appropriate, which included removing all instances of swearing, blood, and toning down some of the more violent scenes, but everything else in the show was left intact. When it came to the Toonzai broadcasts, however, they took it a step further and were home to some of the most notorious anime edits ever made. Yep, this is where the Blue Mr. Popo edit came from, along with other ridiculous edits, like removing Shenron from the intro, adding sparkles to explosions, and changing halos over characters' heads to glowing balls. Obviously, this was all done so the show could fully adhere to the CW's standards and practices, but still. However, even with these egregious changes, the show itself performed pretty well, pulling in about 1 million viewers. Okay, enough of that tangent. For the 2010-2011 season, the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series once again returned to the air on September 4th. Then, a month later, Dinosaur King was dropped from the block on October 9th. Next, Cubix would leave the block on February 12, 2011, and was replaced by Magi Nation the next week. Go figure on that one, but it'll get weirder later on. The 2011-2012 season began with Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's concluding its run on September 10th, and in its place was the premiere of Tai Chi Chasers on the 17th. After that, the fourth Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, would make its debut on October 12th. Then a few months later, Magi Nation was taken off the block for good on February 11th, 2012. And this is where the weird part I mentioned earlier comes in. The next week on the 18th, Cubix made its return to the block. Yep, they replaced Magi Nation with the very show that it itself replaced. It's crazy, I know. Anyways, on March 24th, Toonzai saw the broadcast of the 12-episode miniseries Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters, which ran until April 28th. However, by this point, the block's run was not going to last much longer. Now, you may wonder, what exactly am I talking about? See, back on March 24th, 2011, 4Kids had been sued by Nihon Ad Systems and TV Tokyo, claiming that they had made illegal agreements with other companies, namely Funimation and Majesco Entertainment, that allowed 4Kids to collect royalties from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise without having to pay a portion of it back to either NAS or TV Tokyo. To make a long story short, the result of this lawsuit led to 4Kids filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Following that, on May 1st, 2012, Kids Co-Media Ventures, an affiliate of Saban Capital Group, placed in a bid to acquire some of their assets for $10 million, which didn't end up going through. Then, after an auction between 4Kids, Kids Co., and 4K Acquisition, a subsidiary of Konami, was adjourned, a deal was settled and finalized between the three parties, and on June 25th, 4K Acquisition would acquire the rights to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, while Kids Co. would get all their other assets, which included Toonzai. Thus, on July 12th, they announced that Toonzai would be rebranded as Vortexx, and made its official debut on August 15, 2012. When Vortexx first started near the beginning of the 2012-2013 season, like before, it carried over many shows from its predecessor, namely Cubix, Dragon Ball Z Kai, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal. But it also brought with it a whole lot of other shows, which were Iron Man Armored Adventures, Justice League Unlimited, Power Rangers Lost Galaxy, Rescue Heroes, which of course was placed in the 7 AM time slot, and WWE's Saturday Morning Slam. Also, it is worth mentioning that by this point in its run, Vortexx had become the last of a dying breed, as with the exception of the 7 to 8 AM hour, it was now the only non-educational network Saturday morning block still running. At that time, Fox had gotten back into the Saturday morning game with Exploration Station, which was produced by Steve Rothfeld Productions. CBS had canceled Cookie Jar TV in favor of the CBS Dream Team, now called CBS Weekend. ABC had been running Litton's Weekend Adventure for 2 years, and coincidentally, both were produced by Litton Entertainment, now Hearst Media Production Group, and NBC had NBC Kids, the only other block to still have animated content, but even then, it mainly comprised of reruns of shows from Sprout, and all of their programming fully complied within the EI guidelines, so it was a clear sign that Vortexx was living on borrowed time. That said though, that didn't mean Vortexx didn't go down without putting up a decent fight, and like its predecessor, it did have a decent lineup going forward. Getting back to the schedule, on September 22nd, Cubix was taken off the schedule and was replaced by a second episode of Rescue Heroes. Then, 2 weeks later, Sonic X made its return on October 6th. After that, Vortexx ran the Tiny Toon Adventures Halloween special, Tiny Toons Night Ghoulery, which aired on October 27th and again on November 24th, making it the oldest program to air on the block. Also on that same day, Iron Man Armored Adventures was taken off the block, and 2 weeks later, it was replaced by Transformers Prime on December 8th. Also, they aired a special lineup of Christmas specials throughout that December. first with the Yummy Gummy Search for Santa on December 1st. Yes, they really did a Christmas special based on the hugely popular Gummy Bear YouTube series. That was followed up by Spike Saves Christmas on December 15th, and then Spike's Reindeer Rescue on the 22nd. Next, Power Rangers Lost Galaxy left the block on January 12, 2013. Then, The New Adventures of Nano Boy premiered on March 9th, which took over Rescue Heroes Full Hour for over a month until April 20th when they brought Rescue Heroes back and reduced it to 1/2 hour showing. And from there, it would run for 4 months alongside Rescue Heroes until it left on August 10th. Afterwards, WWE's Saturday Morning Slam was taken off on May 11th, followed by Transformers Prime on June 1st, and on July 13th, the Canadian series Bolts and Flip premiered on the block, notably making it the last new animated series to premiere on network Saturday mornings. On August 17th, at the start of the 2013 and 2014 season, the block debuted The Adventures of Chuck and Friends, B-Damon Crossfire, and the return of the Spectacular Spider-Man, making the latter the very last show to be carried over from the Kids WB years. Finally, on January 18th, 2014, the block would drop B-Damon Crossfire, and the next week on the 25th, the block premiered Digimon Fusion, which had begun airing on Nickelodeon on September 7th, 2013. Then, The Adventures of Chuck and Friends would leave on February 8th, 2014, and was replaced by, you guessed it, another episode of Rescue Heroes. Leaping forward to the late summer, both Rescue Heroes and Justice League Unlimited were dropped from the block on August 23rd, and on the 30th, they saw the return of Cubix, again, and a second showing of the Spectacular Spider-Man respectively. With those shows' departures, the block was now left with just 8 shows, and it would basically coast along in reruns. Granted, not to the extent of the last 4 years of ABC Kids, but still. However, none of this would matter anyway, as Vortexx only had 4 weeks left on the air. On June 5th, 2014, the CW announced they were going to cancel Vortexx altogether in the fall and made an arrangement with Linton Entertainment to program a new block that would fully fulfill the EI mandates, which would become One Magnificent Morning, and it would make its premiere on October 4th. And as mentioned earlier, Linton was also programming CBS Dream Team and Linton's Weekend Adventure at that same time. That, along with the matter of declining ratings, decreasing ad revenue, and the pivot toward cable networks and video on demand. And so, on September 27, 2014, Vortexx aired for the final time with the 89th episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, Darkness Dawns. And with that, it marked the end of an era. While it was very sad to see it end, it was also understandable why this decision was made. No other way to say it, the traditional Saturday morning format was pretty much dead in the water. Thanks to the big children's cable networks providing a lot of non-educational animated content 24/7, video on demand allowing people to choose whatever show or episode they wanted, and especially internet videos, there was no longer a strong desire or urge to get up early on Saturday mornings to watch cartoons. Plus, it had grown more difficult to sell non-educational content to the big networks, as they were more in favor of having low-cost shows that fulfilled the EI mandates and the tightened restrictions on children's advertising. That said though, both blocks did a relatively great job at keeping Saturday mornings going for a while longer, were able to bring some fun energy that the other networks couldn't deliver at the time, and managed to bring in the last fresh batch of new animated series for Saturday mornings. In conclusion, the CW4Kids, Toonzai, and Vortexx were fun and creative blocks. While they may not have been the biggest hits, overall they were able to stand out thanks to them being the last of the non-educational blocks on network Saturday morning, and were successful in bringing unique shows you really couldn't get from the other big networks, especially during this time. Even if it did mark the end of an era for television, they still left an impression with many people who were able to catch them at the right moment. I hope that you all enjoyed this video and that it helped give you a fun insight into the history of the two blocks. And if you did, then please leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments down below. With that said, did you watch either block when they were on? What were your favorite shows from each? And were you sad to see it all end? Until next time, this is Media Nutso saying, thank you all very much, and I'll see you on the next one.